Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, a nice packed house, thank you. My name is Russell Quirk. It's my dubious honour to look after the panel here this afternoon that I'll introduce in a second. We're going to be talking about quite a compelling subject, I think, for all of us, actually, not just landlords and property investors, but what happens after the next general election. And whilst I don't think we particularly want to stand here being overtly political, because unfortunately, apart from us all having a vote, of course, we don't really have much of a say, I guess, in what's going to happen post a general election, which my money is on being in about a year's time, I suspect, probably autumn 2024. I think the question for all of us here as property people, whether you be a landlord or someone in commercial property, someone that runs a fund, a would-be landlord, or indeed one of the many suppliers that are here, or indeed an agent on either the sales or the letting side, is what does the general election mean? And on the assumption that I think we're going to have a change of government. And I don't wish to particularly debate whether we should have a Labour government or whether we should have a Conservative government. I think for the purposes of the next hour, we should just assume that there's going to be a change of government and that Keir Starmer, I think in about 12 months' time, will probably be dangling the keys of number 10 in front of us all. So the question here, the questions for the panel, and indeed for you as the audience, is what does that mean? What does that mean for landlords? What does it mean for the property market? What does it mean for the PRS? And so on. And I think it's one of the most important questions that we can seek to answer. So helping us do that is my wonderful panel here, who I will introduce very briefly, and then maybe they can do a few seconds just on themselves, so that you know exactly who is in front of you, and the assembled wisdom, which is extensive, as you're about to find out. So I'm delighted to be joined, first of all, by Jonathan Samuels from Octane Capital, also Fran Giltinan from Foxtons, Paul Shamplina, who everybody knows, of course, the landlord's friend. He's the Chief Commercial Officer of Hamilton Fraser and also the founder of Landlord Action. It's far too long an introduction for you, Paul, actually. It wasn't very fair, but anyway, maybe I'll clip your explanation in a second down to a few short seconds. And Denis Shail as well from Horizon Letting. So perhaps we can just have some quick intros from them just to get some context. Jonathan, would you go first?
Yeah, thanks very much, Russell. So Jonathan Samuels, CEO and founder of Octane Capital. We are a specialist finance lender, particularly focused on landlords like yourselves, focused on refurbishments and conversions, HMOs, multi-unit freehold blocks and the like. So very much residential and active lending. Thank you.
Thank you. And Fran?
Hi, I'm Fran. I'm a managing director at Foxtons, responsible for almost 30,000 landlords and 60,000 tenants. Foxtons obviously being primarily a London estate agent, the largest estate agent and the fastest growing one too.
Thank you. Should we just skip past Paul and go straight to Denis? No, go on, Paul. Give us 5 seconds.
So I'm Chief Commercial Officer Hamilton Fraser. We own My Deposits, Property Redress Scheme, Client Money Protect, Total Landlord Insurance and Landlord Action and Landlord Zone. And we act and touch about 500,000 landlords and 23,000 letting agents. Brilliant.
Thank you. And Denis?
Denis Shail, Director of Horizon Property Group in Teesside. We're an estate agent. My background's financial services. We manage a good few hundred properties in the northeast, and we help clients build profitable portfolios, developments, refurbishments, things like that.
Great, thank you. Can you everybody hear us okay? I know there's speakers kind of throughout the auditorium here. Can everybody hear okay? Yeah? I guess if you can't, you didn't hear me say that, but hopefully you can. So, but maybe I think we might need to speak up a little bit. Okay, look, let's also have some audience participation. I think that's important. This is about you guys, really, ultimately, property investors and landlords. And I think we should probably gauge the temperature in the room in terms of what you all think is going to happen at a general election. So could I be bold enough to ask for a show of hands to all of those here in the audience that think that I haven't even asked the question yet, sir. But thank you. Very enthusiastic at the front here. Who in the audience thinks that there will be a Labour government in 12 months' time? Who doesn't think that's the case? Okay, I think Labour has it there. No need to run a general election then, that's it. I think that's the result. Can I, again, just to be a bit cheeky, and again, I don't want to be overtly political here in terms of nailing any political colours to the masts, Certainly the panel won't want to do that in terms of, whatever they favour. But who thinks a change of government to Labour from a PRS perspective, so from a landlord and a property market perspective, would be a good thing? Oh my goodness. Wow.
Right.
Okay, I'm stunned. So the majority of the crowd think that it's inevitable that we're going to have a Labour government, but nobody thinks that's a good thing. Okay, wow. Okay, well, let's get straight into the kind of meat and gravy of this then, because it looks like, not that we're here to be Labour Party apologists, but we should try and work out what this is going to look like if Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves and co do indeed get the keys to number 10. Let's start off with Jonathan Samuels. Jonathan, what do you think a Labour government looks like, particularly in perhaps the first few weeks and months of a Labour government? Do you think it's more of the same, or do you think there'll be drastic political changes as far as the PRS is concerned?
So I think, look, you've just seen it in the audience here. It's going to be bad for landlords, unfortunately. We've had it hard actually for years, really since 2015 from George Osborne's changes. We've had it tough, and it's going to get tougher. The balance of power is going to shift very severely from landlords to tenants as Labour really roll out the things that they've said they're going to do. So Section 21 ban, we've had a reprieve with the Tories. They kicked it into the long grass. I think probably sensibly because of the court process not being quite ready yet. That makes sense. But don't expect that from Labour. I think Section 21 ban will come in straight away. Also the eviction, automatic eviction for persistent arrears, they will put a ban on that. And when you factor in as well ASTs moving away, so we're going to go to periodic tenancies, you could have tenants in your property with persistent arrears and it being very difficult to evict them. You add on to that as well, Labour will, and these are things they've announced, that the landlords will have to give 4 months notice of any changes, including rent rises to tenants, whereas tenants will only have to give 2 months notice. So this balance of power is really going to shift, and I think it'll shift quickly. And it's not just in this area either. EPCs, I think that they will push for a minimum of EPC-C for when you're renting out your property. I know that the Tories were seemingly set on that, but then also kicked that into the long grass. But I don't think we'll get that reprieve from Labour. And you may also see an increase in the surcharge on SDLT as well. So you add all these things together, I think it's going to be tough. I don't mean to slam Labour. I think that actually Starmer and Reeves together are relatively sensible, thankfully, fingers crossed. But this is the reality of what they've said.
Okay, thank you. And by the way, if anybody has a burning question or an opinion or a comment, please feel free to put your hand up. I'd like this to be as interactive as possible, really. So it's, the panel are here to kind of give you their view and their opinion, but we also want to hear from you. So feel free to do that as we go. Fran, you're a compliance specialist at Foxtons.
Yes.
So policy guidelines, of course, we've seen lots and lots of diktat from government over the last months and years insofar as Rental Reform Act in particular. Not that that's come to fruition as perhaps they intended it to just yet. What do you think the main things will be from a compliance and a policy perspective that the Labour Party might introduce in, let's say, their first 100 days of government?
I agree. I'm not nearly as negative as you. Sorry, I don't think it's all doom and gloom. There are going to be people throwing themselves off the mezzanine. I think there are quite a few mitigating factors that we've got that will really help a landlord at the same time. So I think if Labour come in, clearly Section 21, I do think it was a reprieve. I don't think they've kicked it out. I think they will bring those in straight away. If you've got your rent protected and you're sensible about how you manage your investment and how you look after your property investment, you will have an estate agent managing it for you that is a trained professional that will help you navigate some of the complexities they bring in. They will probably, yes, bring in a Section 21 straight away, but more often than not, as long as your tenant is paying the rent, landlords don't want a tenant to move out. If you've got your rent protected and they're sticking there and there is this as we know, enormously backed up court system, then your rent will be coming in, which, let's be blunt, that is normally the primary worry of a landlord. We will wait and see what happens with EPCs. Again, I don't necessarily think that will come in straight away, and they will have to be obviously a little bit more cognizant of how landlords are going to afford this and where they're going to get the money from. But I don't think it is going to be all doom and gloom.
Okay, so an array of positivity there. Paul, talk to us about the court system, because if Section 21 is accelerated, is enacted, and indeed maybe even toughened up by a Labour government in 12 months' time, how is a landlord expected to seek possession, and I know this is your area of expertise, if the court system is fundamentally as broken as it is? I mean, do we think that Labour are going to potentially wave a magic wand and fix the court system?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say, Russell, is the Conservatives need to try and leave some sort of legacy, if they can, before the next election. So you say autumn, it could be first quarter of 2025. And actually, I think as landlords, I think we want the Renters Reform Bill to be signed, sealed and delivered before that date, especially when obviously the polls are going to open and stuff. When it comes back to the court system, as I said in my talk downstairs, we've never received so many Section 21 instructions, and I started the business 23 years ago because landlords are selling. I would say to landlords, wait, watch, don't panic. Actually, you are in an area now where you're getting the best tenants than ever before because demand is so strong. I would say that, you know, I was on the housing court working group in 2019 prior to COVID, and we had COVID in the ban.
Whatever happened to the housing court?
Well, that got kicked off. I said at the time, I said 4 years ago, quoting the press, you can't ban Section 21 until you sort the court system out. I said that 4 years ago. You need more judges. There's a real disillusionment with judges. They can't employ enough judges. Bailiff shortage is absolutely chronic. As I said downstairs, bailiffs are on average on £21,000 a year. Who wants to be a bailiff? You need the grounds strengthened in Section 8. We've got to see what they look like. You need to digitise the court system. So the good thing is, and Michael Gove said at the conference last week, that we're not going to ban Section 21 until we sort the court system out.
He's somewhat backtracked, isn't he? On the basis of common sense.
Yeah, it's common sense. So because what happens is, from the 65% instructions we get in Landlord Action, we do 3,000 instructions a year, that will go up to 85% because you'll get landlord panic. So, you know, from working the court system, I've said in the press, it's the worst it's ever been in 30 years. We need to see what they're going to do and how they're going to do it and what's going to happen. But I would say, you know, Labour get in next, you know, the next quarter of next year, what happens. I don't think lot will change. What I do worry about is whether they can bring in 4-month notice periods. But I think the biggest worry, and I'm just ending what I'm going to say now, the biggest worry for landlords is the devolution of power, of actually giving mayors power in cities. So God help us if Sadiq Khan had powers, the biggest threat to everyone in this audience is going to be red caps, you know, and I think that's something that's really going to worry.
And I want to talk about that specifically if we really feel that that's a threat under a Labour government. Denis, landlords being deterred from the sector. Whenever I stand up in front of audiences like this, whether it's at this show or others that are available, by the way, there's always this big question of landlords exiting the sector. And I think when we look at headlines, whether it be in consumer press or certainly the trade press, we do get this impression that there's this huge exodus of landlords, either because they feel mistreated by the current government, or indeed, as I guess the non-show of hands just now rather represents, they're very concerned about what is coming. Do you see that in your business on a day-to-day basis, that landlords are exiting, or is it just them saying that they will, but not backing it up with actually sticking their properties on the market for sale?
Definitely seeing landlords exiting. A lot of amateur landlords, accidental landlords, people who've owned the property for a long time. I'm of the same opinion. I don't think it is all doom and gloom. I think there's some positive outlook there. I think we've got a lot of opportunity around us. If there is policy changes, if there's improvements to EPCs needed, things like this along the way, you'll have not so much rogue landlords, but either retiring landlords or amateur landlords exiting the industry, which creates opportunity for professional landlords coming in, and that's what we're seeing. There's a lot of tired landlords leaving, but there's a lot of new money coming into the sector. And something like a firm message that we deliver in our business is, if you have a subprime property, you have a subprime tenant. Not all tenants are bad. So if you deliver a high-end property, make energy efficiency improvements, improve EPCs, things like that when you're doing a refurbishment, you're generally going to secure a pretty solid tenant. And not everybody wants a turbulent life. Not all tenants are non-peers. So if you're delivering a high-end property in a decent location, you're probably going to get a long-term tenant, wants to be close to the family, kids are in the school around the corner, and that's going to create a decent long-term investment and stable platform for both you as the landlord and the tenant who's living in the house at the same time.
Yeah, and I think that's the point, that what you guys do in terms of investing in the property, the private rental sector, is a long-term endeavour. It's not something that anyone does for a year or even 2 years, maybe not even 5 or 10 years. And despite the ups and downs politically and certainly economically, fiscally, my belief is still that being an investor in the residential property sector in Britain, based on a whole bunch of things, that kind of collision of asset appreciation, yield, and so on, it's still not a terrible place to be. That said, I have to inevitably ask the question, which is, of all the landlords in the room here, how many are sticking, how many are buying, how many are selling? So let me just to get some context in the room. How many of you in the room that are currently landlords and own stock, whether it's one property or 100, how many are considering selling one or more properties? So that's not that many. That's 5% of the room, I would say. And actually that's backed up by the data. So although stock is very, very tight, so the latest numbers that I've seen is that rental stock is about 35% down compared to what it was pre-pandemic. But actually the amount of landlords actually selling is only about 7% of landlords that are actually listing their properties that they've had rented out for sale. And the other interesting thing, I think, is that a lot of these properties that are being sold by landlords are actually being purchased by other landlords. So there may well be fewer landlords, but actually the stock is kind of remaining fairly similar. Fran, can I ask you if that's your experience at Foxtons? Obviously, I'll blow your own trumpet for you here. You're the biggest letting agent in London.
Yeah,
so
we are.
Are you seeing that reflected in terms of volume?
We are, and certainly when you look at what was going on with rental reforms a year ago, a sort of blank piece of paper by the government, everybody was nervous. And without doubt, we saw more landlords, which were what we call dual listings, so going on for sales, going on for lettings. What we've actually seen over the last 4 or 5 months, as there's been a bit more clarity, there's been a couple of wins for landlords over the last couple of weeks with the pause on Section 21s and EPCs, while the government actually looks at the mechanics of how our industry works. We've seen a growing number of landlords go from a sales instruction back into a lettings instruction, and obviously we are working double time to get these properties let. So there is a big difference. I think if we'd have asked that question to the audience 5 years ago, how many people are thinking of selling, the same number of hands would have gone up. Property is still, and being a landlord, a brilliant investment. The genesis of a buy-to-let landlord has always been the derision of pensions in the 90s. We've seen it way worse than this. We've seen interest rates worse than this. Most landlords have been in the game for a long time. They're not seriously over-leveraged. They're still washing their face. They're not overly topping up. And certainly in my 20 years at Foxtons, there were a period where you'd offer a landlord a tenant, you'd say what they were paying, and a landlord would get their calculator out and work out how much is that, am I going to have to top up that for my mortgage? We don't see that in the same way anymore. So now is the time to just sit back, to watch. I'm delighted, I'm sure everybody is here now, that the government seems to be, Rishi's got a couple of years to do, or a year probably at most to do it, but are actually talking to us. They are listening to lobbyists, they are listening to the professionals who understand this business, so that when they draw up this legislation, it will work and fit in with what we see.
Well, and at long last, politicians actually listening to the professionals, the experts. That doesn't happen very often. Let's hope this continues, actually, despite elections and so on, no matter who takes office in 12 months' time or so. Because I think our sector can be seen as something very, very simple, but of course we all know that actually it's quite complex. Another question for the audience. Based on the fact that hardly anybody's selling their portfolio right now, is there anybody genuinely and seriously considering expanding and buying, taking advantage of the market as it is to buy stuff that is most certainly cheaper than it was 12 months ago? So I think I make that more buyers in the room than sellers.
I actually saw some people who were considering selling also put their hand up for buying as well.
Okay. Maybe they're just exercising their hands.
So there's obviously something there.
Jonathan, I'm obviously you're a specialist lender.
Yep.
So you deal specifically around buy-to-let and HMO lending.
Yeah, That's right.
What are you seeing in terms of rates now?
Yeah.
Are they scary?
Yeah.
Are people defaulting left, right, and centre because in the wider buy-to-let market they're not able to afford their mortgages? What are you seeing now from a lender's perspective in terms of appetite and affordability?
Yeah. So people, it's interesting. I mean, people who want to hold, it's all very well and good, and I do agree. If you can avoid selling right now, don't sell. It's just about the worst time to be selling right now. Transaction volumes have really come off about 30% according to government data. So, and look, your properties will sit on the market for a long time. So if you can avoid it, the problem is that a lot of properties aren't washing their face right now. So the FT did a really interesting study recently that showed that the average percentage of rent that you would get after all expenses, including tax, over the last few years had previously been about 25%. So you'd get 25% of your rent basically in your back pocket. Now, because of interest rates, that's down to 3%, according to the FT. And that assumes a 70% mortgage. And if they're saying 3%, that means loads of properties are underwater. So a lot of people just can't actually sit, and sit this out. However, we're not seeing big defaults. Yes, rates have gone up. They've peaked on the buy-to-let side at about 6.8
and
overall.
fixed rates are reducing. I mean, there were a load of lenders that reduced in the mainstream market yesterday by up to 0.25%.
Loads of lenders are reducing rates. Rates have come down on average from 6.8 to 6.3 since August to now. And I'm constantly getting emails in my inbox like, this lender's reducing rates, that lender's reducing rates, which is great because the sense is that the Bank of England is not going to be putting rates up any further, and swap rates on the 5-year swap rate are starting to come down. It changes day by day, but the general trend is down, which allows lenders to lower their rates on the fixed rate basis.
Do you think we've seen the worst of rate increases? So you feel that they're coming down and will come down sustainably?
No. So I think we've seen the worst. So I agree with your first point. Will they come down further and sustainably? No. The Bank of England is signalling that, I don't know if you heard this analogy, but they said it's not going to be like Everest where the rates went up very quickly and then they're going to come down quickly. They compared it to Table Mountain. They're going to go up, they've gone up, and then they're going to stay high for a long time.
When you say high, let's define high. I mean, I remember high being 15%.
Fine. At this level. So I think we better get our mindset switched that this isn't going to reverse anytime soon. Maybe we'll see fixed rates coming off a bit, maybe another 25 bips off a lot of the fixed rates, but you should really be planning for the rates to stay where they are right now for some time. And you can get lower than the 6.3 average. You can get lower than 6% or even 5% out in the market. The issue is it's the upfront fees. So often lenders are reducing their interest rates, but increasing their upfront fees. So you've got to watch that.
Yeah.
But
eyes wide open. Yeah.
Sorry?
Eyes wide open when it comes to the deal.
Eyes wide open. The reason why they're doing it is to help with the interest cover ratio. So can you cover the interest? So if you lower the interest rate, increase the fee doesn't matter, but lower the interest rate.
Right, I'm going to ask Denis a question now. Don't throw anything at me when I say this. Denis, on the basis that you could argue that interest rates have normalised, do you think landlords should suck it up and just wait and grin and bear it and just accept the fact that rates are higher now, but this is normality, whereas rates at 1.5–2% in the mortgage market were artificial?
Hard to say, really. I've got a lot of clients going on variables at the minute, planning to switch in 12 months. Personally, I do think there's potential of the base rate reducing. I was reading a report, looking at some stats over the last week or so, and seen a few suggestions. 2025 might see the base rate reduce quite a bit. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. If it does, major impact on the mortgage market. Like you say, swaps market stabilising significantly. Rates aren't too bad. 5% average, some sub 5%.
Yeah.
Comes down to what property you're investing in, doesn't it?
But on the basis that we talk about property and particularly investing in residential buy-to-let being a long-term thing, it would be, and I think the panel suggested this just now, it would be a knee-jerk reaction to look at the situation today and to sell stock as a consequence, even if you are, as Jonathan says, underwater. So I guess my question is, even if you are underwater, on the basis that rents are increasing by what? And I know this varies from region to region across the country, but rents increasing by something between 8 and 10% across the UK, suck it up.
Depends where it is and what it is, doesn't it? We've got clients offloading stock in London because the yield's so low and the mortgage rate's now so high, releasing equity and redeploying the capital in the northeast, where the yields are 8 and 9%, but the mortgage rates are 5%, so it's leading to a better investment.
Yeah, nice advert for the northeast there, Dennis. Right, Paul, you mentioned rent controls earlier. We've got to tackle the thorny subject. So if you're in London, under the wonderful tenure of Sadiq Khan as the Labour mayor since 2016, and yes, I am saying that tongue-in-cheek, the likes of Sadiq Khan in the Labour Party want to see rent controls. So as an example of the modern Labour Party, he says that he should be given the power to enact rent controls, rent caps on landlords in London. I don't think I need to ask for a show of hands to see how many of you in the room would favour that or not. But let's talk about, I guess, whether we think, as we're talking about the probability, not just the possibility, but the probability of a Labour government in 12 months' time, do we think a Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves government is going to start to consider and impose rent controls across Britain, Paul?
I think, look, the average rent in London's £2,300 a month, you know, and you obviously rent out God knows how many properties, way more than that. A tenant is paying, on average, 35 to 38% of their income towards rent. Now, someone that's been in the game 30 years, that's becoming totally unsustainable. Yes, we've got wage growth that has been, in the last 6 to 12 months, that has really stepped up to a certain extent. Andy Burnham in Manchester said he's in favour for rent controls. I think that it's a landlord's biggest fear. Do I think that's why I said right at the opening gambit, devolution is of obviously powers to mayors is going to be the biggest threat to landlords. You know, what's happened in Scotland? If you know, don't forget
Paul, it's been a disaster. Rent controls in Scotland.
It's been a disaster, and of course, you speak to lenders, and Jonathan will say this. You know, lenders will not invest, and then of course, can you imagine the surge of investment and landlords coming out of the private rental sector, which stands at 19%. The social sector's at 16%. Don't forget, Labour said at their conference they want to try and build 1.5 million properties
over 5 years.
Over 5 years.
But talk's cheap.
Talk is cheap. I mean, look, it's a threat. We have to watch. I think we just, look, you put me in the spot. Do I think rent control is going to come in? I think rent freezes will come in. That's different to rent caps. I think if you look at the detail with regard to the Renters Reform Bill, rent rises once a year. That's not unreasonable. Historically, landlords don't put rents up. They have done since last September with the debacle of Liz Trust, you know, and the panic. I speak to landlords, obviously, all the time I speak to landlords, tenants, letting agents. Historically, landlords rented their properties out for under market rent, but because fixed rates have come to an end, landlords have had great rates at 1% and 2% for many, many, many years. We do have to suck it up. We do have to watch. And I think now it's come to a point, or if you've got a portfolio, what property in that portfolio is a bit of a dud, is not working for you. You get out, you sell it. But actually, there is going to be some great opportunities. You've got cash buyers that are going to come in there, and I think there'll be some really good opportunities next year. We've got to look at it as a whole. But historically, we've got, if we look now, we've got massive demand. You know, on average, I look at right moves, and maybe Frank can put testament to this. 25 tenants are looking for one property. What does that mean? Well, it means that you're actually getting a mini auction. Is that fair enough to say? You're getting the best tenants more than ever. You can get more guarantors that are going to be able to guarantor for the rent. You'll get minimal void period. So actually for landlords, we've got to try and be positive. It can be half full. And I think it's about business review with regard to your portfolio.
So I personally don't think that a Keir Starmer, Rachel Reeves double act will impose rent caps. I think, to Jonathan's point, that they are just about sensible enough to realise the implications of that, and that if people like you sitting in the room here are perhaps not exiting the sector because you're able to increase rent, not because you necessarily want to, but A, because the market dictates that you should, because rents are rising, but also because, of course, your costs are increasing by way of your buy-to-let mortgage costs as well. I think they realised that if they were to cap rents, that would be the straw that potentially broke the camel's back and actually would then lead to lots of landlords exiting the sector. Jonathan, you and I had a bit of a disagreement in the green room, I think, with regard to what might happen with Labour. Do you agree with that statement that we're probably okay with regard to Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves? But then secondly, your point earlier was, but.
Yeah. So my point was that I do think that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are sensible. Not just, well, look, there are certain things on PRS, but also other elements I quite like. Rachel Reeves has been embracing business, been meeting businesses. Portraying a business-friendly face. There's an initiative that they want to set up what I would look at as a sovereign wealth fund. I don't know if you've seen this, but to invest in infrastructure in the country, but do it in a sensible way of like a 3-to-1 ratio where the government puts in £1 for, and where they put £1 in, they want £3 from the private sector. That's great. That sounds almost conservative. It's sensible. So it's not them necessarily who I, as a lender and as a landlord, am concerned about. It's perhaps other people in the Labour Party. And the point that I made to you earlier was, as we saw as I've seen with the Conservatives, you vote for one set of people that you think are going to be in power, the Prime Minister and Chancellor, and then eventually you get a different set of people.
We can't actually remember which Prime Minister we originally voted for in 2019, I don't think. I mean, we've had 75 since. So yes, your point's well made.
The housing ministers, good luck with that.
Well,
yeah.
12 housing ministers in 12 years. Yes.
So I think there are sensible people there trying to do the right thing. The concern is where it goes within the Labour Party. Are they going to be strong enough to rein in the more extreme forces within the party and keep it on track? If they can, look, I've said that I have certain concerns and about this shift of balance of power, which they are genuine concerns. But the rest of it, if they can rein in those forces, I'm okay.
Okay, well, let's see, because literally anything can happen in politics and does. So back to the point about, we talked about devolution a little bit. If there were a Labour government and also Sadiq Khan, who will stand again as Labour mayor in May next year, I think it is, there is a threat, I guess, and Fran, I don't know if you have a view on this, and again, not to be political, but my fear is that the Labour government give the likes of Sadiq Khan and Andy Burnham in big cities that delegated authority to control rents. If that happens, then if you're a landlord with a predominant amount of stock in one of those cities, you may well have a bit of an issue. Now, Fran, I'm not going to ask you to kind of comment on the political ramifications of that. My question to you would be, how on earth, if that were to be the case, how on earth can that be policed from a compliance point of view if you've got all of these different things going on in different parts of the country with regard to different policies on rents?
Well, I think nobody's got a crystal ball, so we don't know what's going to happen. I think they're going to be very careful not to totally destabilise the PRS. The last thing they want to do is sort of really buffer up the social housing. There aren't enough houses there. We know that. We've seen a huge growth in the PRS sector in the last 20 years. So they know they're going to have to be really careful to underpin it and look after it. They've made estate agents their watchdogs, really, when it comes to compliance. We're generally really supportive of two things. We're really supportive of decent homes for tenants to live in as a landlord, and certainly with Foxtons' book, we see the vast majority of landlords look after their investment, look after their asset, look after the tenants within them. So we're supportive of anything that supports a decent, safe home for a tenant to live in. And I think that they will bear that in mind. I think they do need to talk and engage with estate agents if they're going to make us their compliance experts.
And do you think they'll do that, Fran? Do you think they'll do that?
I think there is a way that they may do it. I mean, they may go through the regulation of property agents, which is a topic that comes up and then it goes down and then it goes up and it comes down. Again, we are hugely supportive. Estate agents should be regulated. They should take exams. They should know exactly what they're doing when it comes to protecting a landlord, a property and a tenant. And if they're going to bring in rental reforms, I don't see how they can expect landlords to navigate it and look after it on their own. They should have the qualification, whether it's like Rent Smart Wales or whether it is an obligation to use an estate agent. I don't think just saying there's going to be a portal and you've got to upload your certificates or there's going to be a redress scheme and you've got to be a member, I don't think that will relieve the burden of actually being a landlord and understanding what lies ahead.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, on that point, and I said this at the NRLA conference, you're now at a point where a landlord is professional. The hobby landlord, the amateur landlord, they're done, they're finished. If there was ever a time to use a letting agent, a decent letting agent at that, and that's a task in itself, believe you me, but you actually need to make sure that actually you're seen as housing providers, because as landlords, you have to be multi-asset. You've got to be a compliance officer, you've got to be a social worker, you've got to be a mediator, you've got to be a credit control officer. You know, there's all these different things that you have to do. Under the Renters Reform Bill, a landlord will have to be part of a redress scheme, just like, and we run a redress scheme, we run the property redress scheme, we've got 18,000 members. So your tenant, because the whole point of the Renters Reform Bill was to live in a safer property, have greater security, because the Conservative government, the Labour government, and the Lib Dems have turned around and said, actually, as landlords now, you have to up your game. If tenants are paying 35% of their wages, the vast majority of their wages, they need to live in a decent property, of which 21% of properties out there don't fit the decent home standard in the PRS. I would argue, and I've been on ITV News with Dan Hewitt, I would say the social housing sector is far, far worse, believe you me. But I would say that if people would ask me a question and say, do I think that landlords should get a qualification? I would say now, in this day and age, and don't forget I've been doing this for 30 years, I would say yes. And I think the only decent thing out of Rent Smart Wells, and there's not a lot, believe you me, Russell, would be the qualification, the CPD accredited, because it changes the mindset of a landlord, more so also outwardly, and also the conversations they have with a tenant, because you have to set the tone of that business relationship.
Okay, look, so again, let's ask the audience again. We talked about rent controls being unlikely, we hope, but a potential threat. I think there are a number of other things that we should be concerned about with a Labour government, and again, parking the politics to one side, but purely based on their form, really, both in government and in terms of the things that they've said at Labour Party conference, for instance. So what are the other things that you as an audience might be particularly concerned about? So rent controls would be one. What about the kind of general view that the Labour Party might see the landlord sector as being a very easy thing to bash politically? So from a headline grabbing perspective, to get tenants on side and to favour tenants to the detriment of landlords. So let me give you some examples and see who agrees with some of these. So what do we think a Labour government might do with regard to taxing landlords? So Section 24 stuff notwithstanding, capital gains tax and so on. Anyone here concerned about what the Labour Party might do to landlords from a taxation perspective? Because I think you should be. No one? Really? Some hands going up. No, I think that's a bigger threat than rent controls, frankly. Yeah. What about net zero? Now, again, you might have a view environmentally that we need to do everything we can and more to get to net zero by 2050. We've obviously heard Rishi Sunak recently dial back his ambitions in terms of the pace at which we go, and particularly things like EPCC. If Labour get into government in 12 months' time, mark my words, EPCC, if not worse or better, depending on which side of the table you're on, becomes a thing again very quickly, at a cost potentially, as we've rehearsed here before actually, of maybe £10,000 per property per remediation. People here worried about that? So more people really worried about EPCC than they are about tax. Andy, can I pick on you? Why do you think that's a bigger threat? You're not worried about taxation? Can we just grab the mic? Sorry.
As you know, I'm not a landlord, I'm a developer, so I'm just interested in the whole thing. I think the net zero thing is vastly overblown, personally. It's like hysteria. But everything about the Labour Party, frankly, worries me.
Well, you should declare an interest. You're a Conservative Party member, really.
Yeah, but it's tough being a Tory right now.
Yeah, there's one or two left. Okay, all right. So thank you for that. Anybody else got an opinion? Yeah, sir? Or a question? Or just wants to have a rant?
I agree with most things.
Yeah, sorry, can you speak up a bit, sir? Would you mind?
I agree with everything was said, especially Paul here. I'm not worried about the Labour coming in, because I don't think so. the Conservative managed to sail through pandemic and the finances. They know how to manage the country. The Labour, they chop and change. You talked very much about the rent control, winter, no rent freeze, etc. Now, you haven't talked about the bank's interest rate freeze. You haven't talked about other things freezing against the landlord. It's just landlord, landlord, landlord. I am not very long as a landlord, and you haven't spoken about the unscrupulous tenants who bring people in after they sign a contract in their name, their parents, their elderly, to save $250,000 on care home for them. It's a problem for the decent landlord.
Yeah.
And when someone feels they are, when I'm a landlord, I think I am also as a tenant. I don't give moldy house, cheap house. I give a good standard, and I like to make my tenants happy. But nobody cares very much about the landlords. It's tenants, tenants, tenants.
Well, and it's quite hard to hear, sorry, because there's lots going on besides us here. But what I think you were talking about there were interest rates in terms of the way that they're going. Obviously, we've tackled that a little bit. It's a fact, of course, that the Bank of England are independent. That happened in 1997. Funny enough, when Gordon Brown became Chancellor, the first thing he did was to make the Bank of England independent in terms of the interest rate decisions that they make, based on them basically having one job, which is to control inflation, which, of course, they've done a wonderful job of over the last 12 months. I am being facetious. So the government, unless they take back control of the Bank of England, won't have any say in interest rates. They certainly won't have any control, as Rishi Sunak doesn't now, over inflation, because inflation is supply-led rather than consumer-led. So frankly, these pledges from Rishi Sunak that he's going to halve inflation are for the birds, because he has absolutely no control over that whatsoever. I think what I heard from you as well was better homes, more homes, better standards, basically, which I think 99% of landlords would agree with. I don't know of any landlords, frankly. I don't know what Fran thinks. I mean, she won't want to throw any of her clients under the bus. But is there really a landlord here that's happy to have substandard homes as stock that they rent out to their tenants? I mean, ever come across such a thing, Fran?
There's always going to be a small minority of landlords that at certain times of a month there's a bit of a cash flow, and when you're with the right estate agent, they help you get through those periods in terms of maintenance, etc. Landlords have to be good with their housekeeping. I mean, there's no doubt about that. You cannot be disorganised. You have to have a float of money that you're ready, that if something goes wrong with your asset, you are there to step up and look after it. But in 2 decades at Foxtons, rogue landlords are a tiny minority. The headlines that we read about quite often pertain to social housing, not the PRS.
Paul knows all about slum landlords, don't you, Paul?
Yeah, I do.
You might have seen him on the telly.
Yeah, I mean, look.
How big a percentage of landlords are what we would call bad landlords? And also, what percentage of tenants do you think are bad tenants?
So there's far more bad tenants than bad landlords. I actually said that at tenants convention. I almost got strung up.
I bet that went down well.
Yeah, it went down really well. So, look, nightmare tenants, slum landlords. I did 6 series of it. I'm not doing any more. They are criminal landlords. And we talk about the legislation we bring in. We don't have enough enforcement. I think that if the game has changed now for landlords, and we have to adapt. And what you were saying, Dennis, before, there's older landlords that are getting out, and it's quite tiresome fully managing. Managing an AST, a tenancy agreement. If you add up the hours, they're dozens and dozens and dozens of hours. And actually, if you divide that on an hourly rate, what a letting agent gets, it's actually minimal. And landlords don't put a price on their time. But if you look at the offering now with regard to renting, and the professional tenant that's paying, if you look at all the build to rents that are happening in Wembley, right? If you ask a lot of the audience, do you know what build to rent is? You can ask them now. A lot of people still don't know what build to rent is, and it's only 2% or 3% of our market. And actually, a lot of landlords don't realise that actually that's their composition. So what type of offering, what type of service, and that comes down to the housing provider, where, what is your product? The better your product, the better rent you'll get.
Yeah. Denis, we touched earlier on the fact that Keir Starmer has made a very bold pledge around house building, 1.5 million homes over the next 5 years, so 300,000 homes a year, which, fun enough, was the Conservative Party target. That number, by the way, hasn't been met since the days of the Macmillan government, correct, which most of us probably don't remember, back in the 1950s. So bold claim, lovely headline. if that is achieved, of course, that helps everybody. First-time buyers, tenants, the social housing sector and so on. Can you do it?
Who knows? Good friend of mine runs a big staircase manufacturer in the northeast, supplying house builders, and he said to me he looks forward to a downturn because he knows at the end of the downturn his business is going to get kick-started again, house building will start, new build sites will start kicking back off, and he knows that's when his business will grow. So potentially, yeah. But
well,
it's
as
planning, though,
so
isn't
that
it?
it talks cheap.
Yeah.
Jonathan, if he were to do it, he can't just create the
Can't
headline
print the
and
money.
believe it's just going to happen. So what does he have to do to build 300,000 homes a year?
Well,
Planning reform for a start?
Well, I was going to say, then that's the main thing. Principally, which
But the
which
Conservatives have tried that. And the likes of
I think it's
Theresa
incredibly-
Villiers,
I think
your
it-
mate, scuppered it.
Yeah, I think it's going to be incredibly difficult. And then if you look at funding, you then got to look, where's the money going to come from? Government debt is already at about 100% of GDP. You just can't keep printing money either. So there's roadblocks everywhere. And I think to some degree, it's easier to say it when you're in opposition than when you're actually
Well, you don't have to
in
cash
power.
the checks.
So the Conservatives have been saying it, and then they haven't been able to do it. It's similar, perhaps, with other areas we've seen. We've mentioned EPCCs and a Section 21 ban as well. Saying things and then ultimately they're not happening. I think when it comes to building houses, I think that Labour is going to struggle to hit the targets that they've set themselves.
And Fran, do you have a view how he might do it? I mean, it needs to be done, clearly. So we need that level of housing. Do you think it's just mealy-mouthed words, headlines, or
I
and
think
even if he
it's-
means it, how does he do it?
Exactly that, and that you've basically answered the own question. They've sat on the sidelines. It's very easy for a shadow government to pick holes in what the present government is doing, but what they've still not done is come out and said what they are going to do. Mark Carney has obviously come out and been very supportive of Rachel Reeves. She certainly seems very measured in her policies, as does Keir. I think that when they actually get in, if they actually get in, it won't be quite as easy as they think, and they're going to be on the other side of it then.
Okay. Another question. Who thinks the problem of house building, yes, sir, I'll come to you in a second if I may. Who thinks the problem of inadequate house building in Britain is one of these two things? Either the fault of the planning system or the big PLC house builders that throttle back supply? Hands up who thinks it's the planning system. Hands up who thinks it's the big bad builders, the top 10 that don't build anything when they don't want to. Andy, you put your hand up twice. Well, you answer the question, if you don't mind. Both. Both. But which one more than the other? I think it's the house builders, because there are so many unfulfilled planning permissions in Britain right now. I mean, hundreds of thousands of them that could be built by Persimmon, Bovis, and so on, but they don't, particularly when there's a downturn in the market, because, of course, they don't want to realise their output at 95 or 90% of value, as opposed to 100% like they would have done a year ago. And Andy, so I'm going to pick on you again as a developer. Do you agree? And Andy's a very small developer. You're an SME house builder. So what's the problem? Is it one or the other, or is it a bit of both?
For me, it's both. We've just got planning on a piece of land for 8 houses. It could easily take 20. And I've had it out with the local planning department and the leader of the council. They have rules, they stick to them. I completely agree about the big house builders. I think only 10% of houses are built by SMEs.
Yeah.
But
SMEs don't hold stock bank. You don't land bank, presumably.
I don't have the cash to do that, no. No, absolutely not. But we have a real problem with the delays in planning and, frankly, incompetence of planning committees. You watch some of these meetings and you think, how do these people remember how to breathe, let alone decide on my future? But I just think we should be building much more stuff. If you've got a bit of land that you're going to build on, I'm not talking about cramming them in, but let's be sensible.
Yeah.
We could at least get twice as many on that particular piece of land.
Yeah.
And still have lovely family homes that people could afford.
Yeah. Well, and try and get the permissions through, quicker, certainly. So,
Yeah.
Look, it's... and I'm not sure there's a magic bullet to that. I wrote for the Sunday Times recently saying the problem with the lack of house building in Britain, whilst it's under the control of politicians and the revolving door of housing ministers and so on, the very problem is the politicians themselves. Because, of course, they create short-term headlines without thinking about the long-term implications and consequences of their lack of action. If we could somehow work a way of taking the politicians out the frame, whether they're Conservative or Labour, doesn't matter, then I think we get more properties built. Sir, you had a question. This gentleman in the white shirt.
Yeah, it was more a point than a question, but the shadow government can always come up with ideas of how to balance the power, and as you said earlier on, the balance of power sort of heading more towards the tenant. But every time that any government seems to have meddled with that, it seems to have ended up in the landlord's favour. And even with the changes that we're making now, with more tenants applying for each vacancy, again, it's ending up back in the landlord's favour. We've got more people to choose from. And I think that'll continue when the government actually do take office and they realise that these promises and start sort of doubling down on the promises and really trying to make their targets, and certainly the EPCs, etc., changing to the EPCs. And when they realise it's not possible, because most of the housing stock and the rental stock, or a large majority, can't be brought up to an EPC C grade very easily, and you'd end up with the owner-occupiers being in worse houses, effectively, than the rental sector. When they realise that it can't happen, or can't economically happen, I think it's just not going to happen.
So do you think that the Labour Party will be more sensible? I mean, it's a word that we've used up here a few times this afternoon. Do you think they'll be more sensible in not announcing policies that then they realise several months down the line they can't enact and therefore have to U-turn on? Do you think they'll be more considered before they announce silly policies like trying to make everything EPCC?
They've got to try and win an election, so they're going to say anything that they possibly
Well, once
can.
they're in. And I guess, look, then they don't have to worry too much for 5 years
And that's
in terms of the election cycle.
That's my hope. I think the balance on the other side of the situation we find ourselves now is when they find out that a lot of their policies are impossible, or certainly impossible, and keeping a lot of the PRS in the PRS without a max exodus, I think it'll calm down.
Okay, although if I can just say this very tongue-in-cheek, I am joking, but if the shadow cabinet stays in the form it is now, we will have Angela Rayner as the housing secretary for this country. Doesn't fill me with massive confidence, I have to say. Sir, you got a question? Sorry, microphone. Getting him earning his money now.
Given the need to
Could you speak up a bit, sir? Sorry.
given the need to improve the EPC ratings on the PRS property stock, does the panel think that a Labour government might be more inclined to incentivise on a tax basis landlords to make those EPC upgrades?
Great question. I would hope so. I suspect, given Labour Party's form on being penal rather than incentivising, I think not. What do you think, Paul?
Sorry, I didn't hear the question.
Sorry, yeah, the question was, very good question. Do we think that the Labour Party might be more inclined towards incentive when it comes to improving the energy efficiency of homes, or will they resort to the stick as the Conservatives have done?
I totally agree there should be an incentive.
But do you think that the Labour Party will provide incentive rather than stick?
Around, isn't there?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think coming to your question, I think the first thing that has to come in is there has to be calm, right? I mean, you talked about Angela Rayner, and she was using words like betraying renters and a grubby deal. When you hear stuff like that,
Well, when talking about landlords.
we're talking about landlords and the renters reform and stuff like that. It's them and us. What we don't want is we don't want mass evictions where landlords are getting out serving notices before Section. I mean, that's what I really worry about. I think there should be incentives, without a doubt. I think if a landlord, bearing in mind we're going to have periodic tenancies, I think if a landlord is renting, it's all about security. So it's a little bit of a false dawn, right? I think that what should happen is if a landlord is renting to a tenant, and the average term of a tenancy is 4 years and 2 months, if you rent to a tenant more longer term, you should have some sort of tax incentive. I think if there's EPCs and we don't know what budgets or what grants is going to be, there needs to be some sort of incentive. You need to incentivise landlords to stay in the sector, because otherwise we're in trouble.
Fran, how do you think the government, as it will be, could do that? I mean, could they do that through what is now Section 24? They could reverse elements of that based on certain environmental improvements being made?
Yeah, I think they've got to explain what those environmental improvements are. The EPC algorithm as to how they decide what label you're at is tinkered with frequently. We keep changing our minds, and nobody explains, if you're going to retrofit a property, how you're going to get a heat source pump into a Victorian conversion flat in London. I mean, how are you going to do it? They better dig deep into their pockets. So I think they're going to have to think really carefully about that. I guess a crude, quick way would be, but two things in life: death and taxes. I can't see them reversing the taxes. The taxes on income is mind-boggling to me as to why they would do that. And if they're going to cut corners absolutely everywhere, then they better effectively drop their plans on EPCs, because they've taken away any profit a landlord has got to actually be able to improve their property.
Well, and of course the improvement is it benefits the tenant in terms of their bills, albeit the environment too. Jonathan, maybe an incentive when it comes to subsidising lending rates? Would that fill you with horror?
No, that would be wonderful if they did that, but you can't see them necessarily doing that. There's talk of mortgage guarantee schemes for first-time buyers, so from that perspective, maybe the people who Angela Rayner said can't go to the bank of mum and dad, that sort of thing. But look, there's a correlation between the level of EPC and the level of standard in the property. So low EPC, E and F properties are generally not what they would consider decent homes in other areas, not just in energy efficiency. So the push for EPCC, there is a sense as to why they're going to do it. But to your question, I think it will be stick rather than incentive, sadly. Although, as Fran has said, we really need the next government to incentivize landlords, incentivize everyone in this room, in this auditorium, to stay in the business and keep your properties on the market. Because if you start to pull out, and if the stock of PRS starts to fall, then lower supply, increased demand, rents are going to go through the roof. So they should be doing it not for the good, but for the good of tenants.
Well, and government needs to understand that they need they need landlords, particularly in the absence of social housing. The fact that precious little social housing or affordable housing has been built in recent years. Funny enough, when I last attended this event in April, there was a tenancy activist group outside. I don't know if any of you were here and remember that. And there was, smiles and laughter from the front here. I perhaps ill-advisedly got involved in the social media spat that ensued with not just the tenancy activists outside, but also the likes of Novara Media and Politics Joe and so on, that were very, very much gunning for you lot, gunning for landlords. Apparently you're all evil pantomime villain types. And of course, I ventured to jump in and defend you all on social media, which ended up in a digital bloodbath, resulting in me trying to defend myself and your position, and me being banned from Twitter, would you believe, for 4 weeks. Now, some of you might not think that's particularly a big deal,
Russell,
but it is for me. It is for me. So look, let's hope they're not here now. But my question to those tenancy activists, and it's still a question that they can't answer. And by the way, if any of the left-wing media or any tenancy activists are in the audience now, by all means, stand up, put your hand up. This is your opportunity to ask a question or make a comment. My question is, what would the social sector do without landlords? Because if every landlord in this country decided to remove themselves from the PRS tomorrow, the solution would not be that every tenant goes and finds their £25,000 deposit, grabs a residential mortgage, and becomes the owner of the property that they've been renting for years. That
Russell,
simply would not happen. Anyway, fair warning, any tenancy activists or left-wing media, you've not stood up. So if you have a go at us all outside, you had your opportunity.
Russell, I was just
rant over. Paul, yeah.
I was going to make a point. I try and engage. I work on government working groups and have been for a number of years. And I sit next to Shelter. I sit next to Generation Rent. I try and engage with them. It's a them and us. And you have Shelter. I mean, I've questioned some of their polling. I've been pursued by various people who've been sent loads of stuff on Twitter and so forth. The problem is with organisations, they have a motive. Someone like Shelter, they need £40 million a year to survive. They're a housing charity that doesn't house anyone, okay? And the demonising of the landlords works totally against them. And I have tried to reach out and engage with them. So has, the National Residential Landlord Association. It just does not help our industry.
Yeah. Before we wrap up, because I'm bound to get wrapped up in a second, because I know it seems like this has only been 5 or 10 minutes of fun and opinion, but it's actually been an hour, and I'm sure I'm going to have to wrap up in a second. I want to ask a quick question of the panel for those that actually want to answer it. Not all of them will want to. And then maybe if there's a couple of last questions or points, I'll come to you in the audience. But my question is going to be, given track records, we haven't had a Labour government for 13 years. We did have between 1997 and 2010. Famously, before that was the 1970s. From my memory, those governments, from an economy point of view, didn't go so well. My concern is that the Labour Party, and if we think the Conservatives have done a pretty poor job of the economy over the last 2 years or so, wait and see what happens. I think it might be worse in 2 or 3 years' time. So my question to the panel, and you can abstain if you want to, Labour economy in 5 years' time, better than it is now or worse, Jonathan?
I'm sorry to say worse.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, look, I think not just due to Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer, because as I've said earlier, I think they may be a safe pair of hands. I think it's more, the situation is that our government debt is currently in excess of GDP, and it's the first time since the 1960s. So they're going to get dealt a really tough hand here. They're going to have pressure to spend from their party.
Makes a change for it to be that way around, not the other way
Sorry?
around. Makes a change for it to be that way round,
Yeah.
and them inheriting a bad lot from the Conservatives rather than the other way around.
Exactly. Well, it does, but they're going to get dealt this bad hand. They're going to be under pressure to spend. If they're going to need to borrow in order to spend, cost of borrowing, government debt has gone up. Our deficit is increasing. It's going to be really tough, and so and that's why, unfortunately, I say worse.
Okay, Fran, do you want to venture or abstain?
I think there are huge macro events that are impacting everything, which we haven't even touched upon today. I think there is massive consumer debt. I think there are some real deep issues that no matter who was in, it wouldn't be a quick, simple fix.
Yeah. Okay, Paul, with your political head on.
Look, remember, George Osborne brought in Section 24. It wasn't the Labour government, and that's been one of the biggest hit. I would say a positive message to landlords. You're very flexible and adaptable. You'll be able to adapt. Just watch and wait. I am a little bit sitting on the fence, but the biggest fear is the devolution and rent controls. That's what I'm worrying about a little bit.
But there will always be demand in your
Demand,
sector.
yeah.
There will always be demand, no matter what. Dennis, political man, Labour economy, thumbs up, thumbs down. What do you think?
I think I'll be in a much worse position. Same reason. Lots of debt burdens in the background, long term.
Yeah. So external influences.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'm sure that if the Labour Party were in power now, certainly the economy would not be in a better place than the Conservatives have handled it so far. Okay. Look, we need to wrap up. But look, any burning questions or comments or opinions from the audience? I think that's a hand right at the back. You're going to have to get running. Sorry. I think we've got room for a couple. Whatever matters to you most. Any question you want answered by any of the experts on the panel here, or just to have a rant?
I've got a concern with Angela Rayner. She mentioned is this a gimmick? She mentioned that the tenant will have an option to buy the landlord's property. I mean, can anyone shed any light on that policy she come out with?
Well, I mean, I think it has been muted by the Labour Party, compulsory purchase, or effectively right to buy as a tenant of a landlord's property, which I think would be literal property theft. That would not be something that I would advocate or vote for. I'm not sure that's a Labour Party policy. Are you concerned that because of Labour's form and because of some of the musings in the press in recent weeks and months to try and appeal to their base, that you think that might be possible, that might become a policy?
Well, I think it's more of a gimmick, really, to try and get votes. But when you hear things like that, if Labour do get in, all our investments are all under threat.
Yeah. But I hear you, but I think Jonathan's point is well made, that it does seem that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are more moderate than certainly we could have had in 2019 under the likes of Jeremy Corbyn and John McDonnell. Yeah. They were talking about nationalising everything. Not just industry and the utility companies, but yes, potentially property too. I don't think that's on the card.
No, interestingly enough, I've heard it mooted the other way, that they're going to stop right to buy for social housing because they don't want social housing to be removed from the social housing stuff. So it would be incredibly ironic if they then introduce right to buy in the PRS sector. I mean, I wouldn't put anything necessarily past them, but as you've said, I couldn't see Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer doing it.
It's unlikely, I think. Okay, anybody else? Sir, yes, in the middle here. Should we just keep going until someone chucks us off the stage? I don't know who's next, if there's another panel directly after us, but as I say, this is important for you. So if you've got a burning question, please ask it.
I think it's important to remember that the landscape has changed so much in the last 25 odd years. Under the Blair-Brown government, and I am no way a fan of Blair-Brown, but we had a far more capitalist economy than we did under Cameron and Osborne, who we just had a wave of attacks against us as landlords. And in the last 4 years, especially COVID was the great excuse, we just descended into an orgy of socialism. So really, when you look at both sides of the house now, there's no discernible difference. So in a case, it's irrelevant almost who's going to get power next year. You're just going to be more of the same. And when we talk about, as Paul was, with devolution of power, rent control, and we as landlords, we hone in the word rent, and we panic about that. The key word is actually control. It's no different from price control, emissions control, planning control, building control, birth control. We see how well that's played out in communist China.
Are you suggesting that we shouldn't be controlled? We should not be controlled?
No, absolutely not.
It's big state stuff.
Of course it is. And what would all these gimmicks we're talking about, incentives for landlords, we don't want any of that. We want a free market, which is far more organic, and that will cleanse out all the toxicity and give us a far more vibrant capitalist market. Get rid of regulation, get rid of taxation. No modern day politician has the balls to do it because they're all much of a muchness. They're all socialist or socialist light. But if we want a truly vibrant economy, that's what we've got to do.
No, I don't disagree with any of that. I mean, it's the current government, labelled as a conservative, is most certainly a socially democratic, a social democrat government. Interesting fact, over the last 60 or 70 years, the prime minister under which the housing market in terms of capital values has performed the best, not Margaret Thatcher, but Tony Blair. So Tony Blair, as Prime Minister, oversaw the greatest increase in house prices that we've seen since the Second World War. So maybe it isn't all so bad. One more. Any more questions? Lady here, just in the middle.
I think I will continue on the line of the gentleman who just spoke, because I think we need to rebalance a little bit the audience here,
Sure.
Because I think we have quite a few party members, and I want to remember all the group of landlords and PRS people here that we had least trust. So, now we are very much reassured by, Rishi Sunak, at least his appearance, because he's basically a continuation of the previous, government. But we had the worst times. I don't think, we've seen improvements. We have been through continuous regulation. Obviously, the sector couldn't continue like, the sort of liberalized as it was. And we face lots of challenges as, planet. So this is true for any government. So I think, just remember that Starmer is the most moderate wing of the Labour Party, and actually all the Corbynists that have been thrown out in a way that has been almost quite a scandal, I must say.
I'm not sure the Corbynistas have been thrown out.
Considering that, the Labour even won the snap election, which is hilarious with Corbyn. But I agree, I'm moderate, I'm a landlord, I want good government. And I don't think we got an example from, I think after 15 years, it would be healthy for any system to have a change of power. And I think, don't forget least trust, I think we had the worst moment. So if you're in fear of, what's coming next, just remember.
Okay, good points, thank you. And look, you're right. Most governments do and say lots of things, but without much effect. One of the biggest problems, of course, is not which government is in power, as in their political flavour. It's what's known affectionately as the blob. And the blob is the civil service, it's the most senior members of the police force and the NHS and so on, that seem, post-pandemic, in my opinion, just to do what the hell they want, despite what politicians might enact and tell them to do. That's the biggest problem. Right, look, this has been fascinating, particularly the audience engagement and, of course, my panel's contribution here. So, look, thank you very much indeed to Jonathan and to Fran, Paul and Denis. Thank you to you. It's been a blast. Thank you very much indeed. And stay for the rest of the show, please. Thanks.